So I'm going to go ahead and launch Visual Studio. I have it pinned down here on my taskbar, but you could also search for it. And you might need to key in Visual. There it is. And I've installed Enterprise on my system, but you could also use Developer or Professional. And when you first enter, you get this little interface. And if you don't want to start in this interface, you can just click on Continue Without Code, and then it takes you right into Visual Studio. What we're going to do is create a new project. So either I could click on this button, or I can go right into the interface. Either way is going to work. It takes you basically to the same place. So clicking on this button and going into File, New, and Project take you to this screen. And what we want, when you first walk or come in here, you're going to see all languages. And what we want is C#. And there's quite a few different types of applications you can create. And to narrow this list down, we are going to search for MVC. And then our list gets down to 4 instead of 20. And what we want is the ASP.NET web application, but we want the one with C#. So you'll notice there's Visual Basic and C# listed. We want the C# one. So we're going to click that one and click on Next. So on this screen, this is where you have to enter your project name. And for our first project, we are going to call it MVC First App. And for these first couple projects, you don't have to worry about putting them on GitHub. We will start doing that in week 2. As far as the location goes, if you are at home when you do this, you can just put the app in the default location. If you're at school, you don't want to do that. You're going to want to change the location, either put it on a jump drive or put it on the Q drive so you don't lose anything when you shut down your machine. Then, by default, it does not put the solution in the same directory as the files. And just for simplicity, we are going to have it put the solution and all of the files in the same directory. So you want to make sure that's checked. You've given it a name. You've checked the location. We're going to hit Create. What we want is an MVC application. And we're just going to create one with the minimal scaffolding. And all scaffolding is there are pages that are created for you. So this first one, we're going to do minimal scaffolding. We're going to take a look at the folder structure. And then we will be creating another one with authentication and unit testing, which would be more like the maximum scaffolding. So you can see what the difference is. So for this first one, all we're going to do is select MVC and click on Create. And I'm going to go ahead and pause this because you certainly don't need to watch that. Because what it's doing is the scaffolding. It's setting everything up for us. Once it has created the scaffolding, you're going to see a folder structure in the Solution Explorer. So if you can't see the Solution Explorer, you are going to want to make sure that you display it. So under View, just select Solution Explorer. And in MVC, once it creates the application, as long as you have at least one controller, and if we click on the arrow here, you can see by default we do have a home controller, you can actually run the application. To run the application, there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can press F5, or you can click on this Run button. And this Run button does allow you to pick different browsers. So, you know, if you wanted to display it in something besides the default, you could select a browser from here. I'm going to go ahead and display it in Google Chrome. So I'm just going to click on the button. And you'll notice that it does compile. If there are errors, you will see an error message and it will not automatically display and run your app. It'll ask if you want to run from the last successful build, but really what you want to do is fix your errors. And what you're going to see is it is going to launch the browser. And so by default, it is launching it from your machine. So you're going to see localhost followed by a port number. And the port number is going to be different every time you run it and for different people. So yours is going to be different than mine. If this does not happen, it is probably because you've got IIS, which is Internet Information Services, turned off. And you need to make sure it is turned on. And you can access that from the control panel. It's under Programs and Features, and then Windows Features. You'll see a little box, and let me pull this over so you can see it. Okay, but this is the little window that you'll see, and you do need to have that on because it uses that to launch your application. So out of the box, what you're getting here is an interface with a menu, and this is a Bootstrap menu. And it is fully functional at this point. So if all you wanted was a menu and then 3 different pages, you can actually customize this and it'll all work. So let's take a look at those files that were generated for us, and we're actually going to make some changes to them. Now, when an application is running like this, there are 3 different components that come into play. There's something called a controller, there is a model, and there is a view. A model is basically a C# class that is used to store data. And at this point, we don't have any models. The controller, when you key in a web address, the controller is actually what you are interacting with. The controller determines if you need data and if you need to see a view. And it basically reroutes you to the view that you need to see. So whatever you're looking at in MVC ends up being a view. So when I click the About button, it goes through the controller. The controller says, oh, you need to go to the About page, and it routes me to the About view. And when I click on Contact, it goes through the controller. The controller says, oh, you need the Contact view, and it routes me to the Contact view. So the initial point of contact or entry point in MVC are the controllers. And what the user ends up seeing are the views. And the graphic that probably illustrates that best from the notes is this one. The model, again, is where you would have your data and all of the data rules. And the controller is that main entry point. So everything goes through the controller. Any kind of data that you enter, basically the controller is kind of the brains of the application, so to speak. So it determines what you want to do and it routes you there. If you are looking at anything in MVC, every page you're actually looking at is a view. So the view is what the user sees. Okay, then the user executes a command. That command goes through the controller. Controller figures out what view to display. The view is then shown to the user. User executes a command, goes back through the controller. When we get to the point where we are dealing with data and we're keying in data into forms and we're storing that data in a model, it's the controller that interfaces with the model, not the user. The form is a view. You key in your data and you submit it. That goes through the controller. Then the controller is the one that does the updating. So everything you see is pretty much a view, and everything gets routed through the controller. That's really important to understand in MVC. So we're going to take a look at the controller and views, and I'm going to close out of this application, which will stop it from running. So I can either click on the X, okay, that will work, or I can come in here and I can hit the stop button. So once you stop that application, you can actually modify your controller. What's interesting with MVC is because the view doesn't really access any data, when the application is running, you can modify the views all you want, and it'll pick up the change. You just can't modify the controller if the application is running. And that kind of makes sense because the controller is making decisions about what you need to see, and the view doesn't really do anything that's smart. It just displays. Okay, so if we look at the controllers, you'll notice there's a home controller by default. And then if we expand views, you can see that we have about, contact, and index. And that corresponded to the items on the menu. That also corresponds to what you see in the controller. So let's take a look at this. So looking at our controller, you can see it's a home controller. The base class for this is controller. And then we have several different action methods. Okay, so these are methods. We have one called index, one called about, one called contact. So those action methods correspond to the different view pages. So that's another thing that is kind of important to understand in MVC. Okay, so it's got the action methods corresponding to the views. So if we were to pick the about command on the menu, this is why it routes to the about view. And when we picked the contact command on the menu, it automatically routed to the contact view. So all these little default things that happen in MVC are called conventions. And it is important that you understand what they are, because obviously you don't want to change the name of an action method, because that'll kind of break the whole mechanism, right? If I changed about to more about the company, that would totally break how that menu worked. So we are going to take another look at what's inside these action methods. You'll notice the first one, index, just returns a view. So all that does is route to this index CS HTML file. And we can look at it if you would like. So you'll notice that we have HTML in here. In addition to some funky looking things that start with @ signs, so that is Razor code. And we use Razor code when we want to access data in MVC. Otherwise, if you don't see the funky little @ sign, you're basically looking at HTML. So for the index page, most of what you're looking at is HTML. And because we're using Bootstrap, you'll notice that we have classes for formatting. And then you'll also notice we have a viewbag property. So this is used to share information between the controller and the view. Okay, and it's one of the ways that MVC dynamically shares. So in the home controller for index, we aren't really specifying anything for the view bag. So all this is doing is it's adding a title property of homepage. And we're going to go ahead and change the index method. And instead of going to the view, we are going to have it return a little message. So we're going to change this. Actually, I'm just going to comment it out. And then I'm going to have it return. And you're going to put in your first name, awesome index. So what this is going to do, instead of going to the view, let me get rid of that. Instead of going to the view, it's going to return this message. And in order for this to work properly, we do need to specify that we are returning a string. And right now it says action result, so it is expecting us to reroute. So we're going to change that to string. So it is returning a string. Here's our string. And that's what it's doing instead of going to the view. So we're going to go ahead and run this. And you can see it now is showing us the string instead of going to that view. And there's one other thing I wanted to show you with these conventions. You'll notice in About and Contact, we have a viewbag message that's being set, and then it's going to the view. So by default, it's going to go to a view that has the same name as the action method. So that's a convention. And so let's take a look at About. Okay, so it's setting the title property here, and it's displaying it. And then it's displaying the message. And the message got set over here. Okay, so we've got basically an object and a property here. Okay, and we've got an object and a property here. And then we're using our HTML to display them. And because it is dynamic, we are using Razor code, which has got the @ sign. to display them in the page. If we don't put the @ in, what we're going to see is viewbag.title. So if I take the @ out and I take a look at that page, let me run this, or actually it should still be running. Let me go refresh here. To get to the contact page from here, because I'm not on my index page that has the menu, I do a slash and I say home/contact. And then I can get to about from here as well. Now let me go in here and save my change to about. Save all. And we'll come back over here. Okay, so when I take the @ out, this is what I get. So that @ is really important for it to pull in your dynamic data, and that is Razor code. And let me save here again. Now, in case you were wondering where all of the Bootstrap stuff is, that gets pulled in content. The content folder is also where you're going to put any kind of graphics. Okay, so this is kind of the equivalent of a media folder. In MVC, we just call it content. So at this point, you want to make sure you've saved everything, and you can stop this. And the next video is going to show you how to create an application with more default controllers. Basically, we're going to add in authentication and unit testing.